revolution is happening in the commercial space industry. In the past 7 years, we've seen dozens of startup companies raise funding and begin deploying constellations of satellites into low Earth orbit. Space, which used to be a domain only accessible by superpower nations, is now becoming a new platform for innovation from the best and brightest in Silicon Valley and around the world. Welcome to the IQT Podcast. Today, we kick off a 3-part series where we will explore the history of space and how IQT's investments and insights have helped advise and shape the technology to help enhance national security. On today's episode, we'll focus on IQT's origin story in the history of space. I'm your host, Vishal Sandesara, and joining me today are Dave LoBosco and Tom Gillespie. Dave leads a team responsible for identifying and executing investments across a wide range of technologies, including space technology, autonomous vehicles, robotics, advanced manufacturing, and power and energy. Prior to joining IQT in 2014, Dave was a senior principal engineer at Orbital Sciences Corporation. At Orbital, Dave worked on small satellite development and demonstration programs for national security applications. Dave received a BS and MS in aeronautics and astronautics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Tom serves as a managing partner in InQtel's investment team and as an investment lead for InQtel's field technologies practice, where he is responsible for identifying technologies that address challenges faced by the intelligence community. Dave and Tom, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thanks, Vishal.
Thanks, Vishal. Good to be here.
Tom, why don't we start with you? You and I have had this conversation in years prior. You've been around since sort of the very beginning when InQtel started to look into space as a potential for investment and further research and insight. Why, and you were, of course, part and parcel to this, you and your colleagues. Why is it that InQtel started to look at this domain in the first place when it did? So, certainly why and when, I think, are important dimensions to sort of uncover. And what are the opportunities that we sort of saw at that time?
Yeah, sure. So it's a really interesting story, and it's one that we haven't been really able to tell in full detail. But we started really looking seriously at this sector back in about 2014. Prior to that, we'd done a few space-related investments. They were sort of opportunistic. They weren't really part of an overall strategy. What we saw was happening in, I'd say, kind of late 2013, early 2014, was the venture capital market was starting to pay attention to this as a sector. Not a ton of investors, but we started to see some really interesting investments along the way there. And that plus, the SmallSat revolution. So, what you can do with satellites, how much they cost, how easy it was to get them to space. All of that was changing. And so that together allowed us to get into some deals that we thought were pretty interesting for our customers and made a lot of sense to start looking at the sector. So those are the origins at that point. What we really started doing was scanning the whole sector at that point in time. So it wasn't that big. It was probably 50 or 60 companies. We went and talked to almost every one of them at the time. We went and talked to all the active investors in space, which again was not that long a list. And we started engaging customers about what we saw was happening in the commercial sector and trying to start getting them up to speed and interested in at least following it. So that's kind of how we got started. And I'll turn it back over to you. But the origin story really begins in that sort of late 2013, early 2014 timeline.
And open question to either Dave or Tom. What is it that you sort of noted in the early days? What were the good old days like? I mean, speaking from a perspective of someone who's really started focusing in on this in the present, I myself have been privy to all the stories of sort of the billionaire space race, the evolution and advancement of space tourism, sort of the consumerization, I guess, is where my interests lie, only because of my exposure. But what was it like in the time frames that you're all talking about and during the origin times and thereafter? What were the things that were of interest? What were people talking about? Where was the money flowing? And what is that, our customers cared about the most?
Sure. I can jump in here. At that point, we were looking at CubeSats as a big trend. Even in your intro, Vishal, you talked about how previously the domain of space was superpowers, large nation states to get into space. But in the early 2000s, it was mostly at universities, hobbyists looking, could you build a CubeSat the size of a loaf of bread, launch it into space, prove that it could send a little beep back down to Earth, that it made it into space. But around that time, in that 2013, 2014 time, there were actually companies forming using that CubeSat, SmallSat technology and actually building businesses around them rather than just being a hobby. So we took note of that and started looking at it pretty seriously to see if one, could these businesses become real and make money? And two, could our partners in the U.S. government take advantage of that technology to purchase that data coming from those satellites to help augment their capabilities for their national security mission?
And Dave, you mentioned CubeSats and SmallSats. I assume those are maybe synonymous or perhaps exactly the same thing. Could you, on behalf of myself and our listeners, could you explain what a CubeSat is and how it might be different than some of the satellites that we've perhaps heard about anecdotally in the news and just by way of science class?
Sure, yeah. So a CubeSat actually has a definition. A 1U CubeSat is 10 centimeters cubed in a size, so you could fit it kind of in your hands, hold it in the palm of your hand. There's also different sizes, 1U, 2U, 3U, 3U being more like the size of a loaf of bread or a bottle of wine. Very, very small, whereas traditional satellites, from the 70s, 80s, 90s were the size of a school bus. So much smaller, much more modest capabilities. But that's the idea of a CubeSat. A SmallSat we sort of think about as being a little bit bigger, more like the size of a 2-drawer file cabinet. You can fit a little bit more in there. You can actually fit a telescope in there if you want to do an Earth imaging mission with decent resolution, somewhere in between that CubeSat and the really big traditional satellite.
And what is it that drives the miniaturization of satellites in the first place? I will very analogously and naively suggest that perhaps technology is advanced, things get smaller, cheaper, faster, better. Is it the same answer there? And if not, what else happened that made these small sats become more popular or even available?
Yeah, a lot of it is sort of the byproduct of all the investment that went into mobile phone technologies. So the higher power processors that are more power efficient, the better battery technologies that you can have more juice in a small battery that lasts longer, and the communications technology. So it's really everything that's sort of been driven by the computer industry, the mobile phone industry, that allowed these folks to build these smaller satellites.
I see. And Tom, as we think about the historical involvement that IQTEL has had by way of investments, technologies, and capabilities that we're most interested in, what were some of the most important aspects related to this industry that we as IQT focused on when it came to looking out at this domain on behalf of our national security partners?
Yeah, so picking up on Dave's points, when you've got these small satellites that are much, much cheaper and easier to get to space, it changes the paradigm of what you can do with satellites. So one of the interesting things you can do is put a lot of them up cheaply and get better coverage of what's happening around the globe. So your temporal resolution, so how fast you can cover things that are happening around the world, that changes if you have a lot of different sensors up there. So we start looking pretty seriously at a bunch of different types of small sat constellations, optical, synthetic aperture radar, RF, all of these different areas. We were seeing multiple companies kind of springing up that looked at leveraging small sats to use those modalities and do different types of sensing. In order to get those up there, we looked at, even back then, the large number of small sat launch vehicles that we're starting to see. So, launch is part of the story. Early on, we made an investment in Rocket Lab, met them in 2014, closed a deal with them in early 2015, I think, and they've been certainly a leader in that sector. So launch is a key part of the story as well. And I think the third part of it was remote sensing analytics. So we started to look at, once you have all this data coming off these sensors, how do you really make that useful for the government or for commercial markets? And so we did investments in companies like Orbital Insight that work with remote sensing data to bring answers to interesting business questions.
Tom, you mentioned Rocket Lab and Orbital Insight. Might be a good time for us to talk a little bit more about some of the early investments that IQTEL made that we're sort of most proud of. Can you both of you perhaps talk a little bit about some of the early investments, how those investments may have helped shape or influence those companies, but more so help shape and change the perspectives on some of the customers or partners that we made those investments on behalf of?
Yeah, so a little more on sort of the investment history. As Tom mentioned, we've been a very active investor going back to 2013, even earlier. And some of these deals have been announced that we can talk about. Rocket Lab, of course, being a key enabler with low-cost small launch vehicle. But we've also looked at some other enabling technologies in addition to launch around communications. So antenna technologies, both on the ground and the space side, different steering techniques, electronically steerable, mechanically steerable, higher bandwidth, lower bandwidth, to provide that connectivity so that once the satellites are in orbit, how do you get the data back down and disseminate it to the people that need them? In terms of the satellites on orbit, the constellations, certainly we've looked at all the different modalities, imaging, synthetic aperture radar, RF sensing, communications. A couple interesting ones to mention are two deals we did in synthetic aperture radar, both domestically and internationally. So investments in Capella Space here in the US and ISI based in Finland. One of the things we really take to heart is that the US doesn't have a monopoly on innovation. We want to make sure we're supporting domestic technologies as best we can, but we also want to realize that there's really good tech coming from different places around the world that our partners in the U.S. government should be able to take advantage of. So that's one of the areas we've done that, is looking for the best coming out of any sector, any part of the world that we can work with, and leveraging that tech for our partners in the U.S. government.
So one of the things I think I should mention too is that after we did that initial survey of companies back in 2014, one of the things we did was put together a framework for investment. So the deals that Dave and I have been talking about were not done in a vacuum. It really was kind of a systematic, strategic look at, what was in the market, what was most relevant to our government customers, and how do we think about the things that we want to do in the commercial sector to address those needs. And so it really was a strategy we put together from early on. And that framework that we created back then has morphed over the course of time, and it still exists in a much more detailed fashion. But that was really how we started coming at it even back then.
Along the lines of the framework and sort of the way the framework may have looked back then, Tom, did you get the sense that In-Q-Tel was early on in comparison to, say, other venture money or other venture investors in looking in this domain in the way that we did? And or did you get the sense that we were sort of syndicate investors along with others? Who was sort of leading the charge from your perspective at this time?
Yep. So as you know, our model really requires us to co-invest, and so we're always on the lookout for for co-investors we like, we think are on the leading edge and doing good deals. So some of those in this sector have included Bessemer Ventures, RRE Ventures, Lux, Coastal Ventures, just to name a few of them. And so getting in with really good partners it really allowed us to find the good deals, make them successful, and I think that was really key.
Did either of you ever get the sense from anybody else at the time, y'all are crazy? Why are you looking into this space? Were there any antibodies that you dealt with? What were some of the common sort of negative comments you might have endured when you were sort of forging this path for In-Q-Tel?
So I'll go first. I'm sure Dave has a long list too. Yes, all over the place. So on the investment side, people are looking at this going, this will never make money. I don't know what you guys are doing. So there were a few people that were interested in investing, but there are a lot of people that were like, I'm not going to touch a space deal. I don't see how or when this is going to make money. On the government customer side, I think we'd gone through a cycle maybe 15 years before where it looked like the commercial market was starting to build, and then it just kind of fell apart. And I think there are a lot of people within the government who looked at this and said, same story all over again. I'm not going to get engaged. So that's changed in the years since then. But early on, I think there were large portions of the government that really didn't think we needed to pay too much attention to the sector.
Yeah. And I think just to go back to the CubeSat idea earlier, a lot of folks thought that was just a hobby, toys people were playing with, and didn't realize that the technology had matured enough that you could collect really meaningful data even from these CubeSats or SmallSats.
Did you get the sense that perhaps if the money came, other investors would follow? Maybe some of the antibody comments would subside. And if so, when and how did you get a sense that this industry is making money? We made the right bets. We should double down. Did that time ever come, or do you think it'll come? Especially vis-a-vis like the SPACs that we're seeing in the space as well.
We could do a whole podcast on SPACs. Yeah, it's been interesting. One of the trends of this sector in general is that really until the last year or so, there haven't been that many financial exits. There have been a few, and they've been relatively modest. And then the SPACs, the SPAC trend really started probably late 2020, really in earnest. I know there were a few before that, but as that started getting rolling, I think that created exits, and then behind that, it created a lot of private rounds that got done because of the anticipation that these things could eventually, go out via SPAC. So that's really changed kind of the perception of whether or not you're going to get a return in this market. As you see these things go out, get big valuations, that's brought tons of investors into the market. I think some of them will come in and out pretty quickly, but I like to say, like 5-6 years ago, you could put all the space investors in basically one small room, and we all knew each other. And that's not true now. It's people from all directions coming into the sector.
As a strategic investor, IQT is primarily motivated by mission impact. What is it that we can invest in that actually makes an impact for our national security partners? How can we bring to bear technology and capabilities that help mission? Could either of you talk a little bit about this concept of the equity-only investment and how that lends itself well to sort of that kind of an outcome? Again, not being primarily financially motivated, of course, secondary or tertiarily concerned, but really the equity investment is being a tool to sort of deliver value to our government partners. Any thoughts there on how that is an appropriate vehicle or an appropriate choice?
Yeah, some thoughts, and definitely I know Tom will have some additional ideas to offer. This is a tool that we've used really well in space investing. A lot of these companies were very early stage when we started to get to know them. It wasn't clear how long it would take the technology to mature. It wasn't clear how long it would take our partners in government to get comfortable with the idea of leveraging this commercial technology. So we, in most cases with these investments, we started with a very small equity-only investment. Affords us a board observer seat, gets a relationship with the company, but we kind of help build that relationship, give them some advice of where they should go, and track their progress. As they mature, and many of these have, we follow that up with one of our more traditional investments. We call it a work program, where there's some funding to adapt or enhance the technology in some way to make it a little bit more applicable to a government use case, but it's also very squarely on their commercial roadmap, so they see the benefit from the commercial side. So that equity only is a good stepping stone to track progress, to get them a little further along, and then we can follow that up with our more traditional model, which is providing impact for our partners in government.
Yeah, I'd say of the 25 or so portfolio companies that we have in the space sector, a really high percentage of those started with equity-only deals, and I think that's very helpful for us. I was going to refer back to one interesting case study is Rocket Lab, where I mentioned the timeline on that one. We started that with an equity-only deal, and we literally couldn't do a larger deal, a development-focused deal, until later on, because they had to sign a treaty between the New Zealand government and the United States government in order for us to be able to fully engage and talk to them about the details of their technology. So in the meantime, though, we were already in that deal for at least a year and a half, and kind of exposed the company to our government customers and got dialogue going, and that was just really helpful to be able to do that, even though we couldn't come in, couldn't jump in with both feet until that treaty got signed.
Yep. We mentioned a few of our portfolio companies. I'd like to quickly dedicate a little bit of a shout out to some of the more notable ones in the space. ThinkCom in 2008, DSSP 2011, Rocket Lab 2015. We mentioned that one. Orbital Insight, Dave, very familiar to you, of course, 2015. ISI in 2016, and Capella Space and Cape Analytics 2017 were some of our early investments in the space, pun intended. And I want to stress that and correct me if I'm wrong, both of you, but that we were actually early investors in many of these. We were sort of early money in, and that gave us sort of a strategic advantage, I'd say, on behalf of how we were able to bring to bear the capabilities that these companies offered and technologies that they offered to our government partners. Tom and Dave, I believe in 2016, you all convened a group of space investors. Tell us a little bit about how that was. Were there a lot of people, not a lot of people? How did that compare to sort of the early days when you were first sort of starting out dealing with a bunch of people telling you you're a crazy person? What did things look like in 2016 when everyone sort of gathered after a few years of trying out the thesis?
Yeah, again, that was still relatively early. So it was not it was everyone, frankly, that I knew pretty much that was in a deal with us that was interested in the space sector. And we were in a lot of the deals, but it was still only probably 20 people or so. And we had, really interesting dialogue around where we thought the market was going, how this is a venture play, how we saw kind of things playing out along the way. but core group of really good investors, but not a long list. And so, as we talked about earlier, that clearly has changed quite a bit. I will say that those are all people that we're still very much in touch with, and so that core group still is out there, still pushing deals in the sector, and really kind of underpinning what's happening. And if I could just riff for a second here, I think that was one of the nice things about when we got involved and how we got involved in the sector. Was the people we're dealing with, not just internally at InQtel as we create the strategy, but externally with folks like that. It's a really entrepreneurial group of investors, I guess, passionate about the sector, realistic though about the business, and they've been great partners along the way.
Let's switch gears for a moment and talk. In addition to investments, InQtel has dedicated quite a few resources by way of research and also producing quality data sets and things to help support the nascent industry at the time. Let's talk specifically about the Commercial Space Market Survey. This is a 2014 framework and sort of landscape research, that market landscape research that was conducted. That sort of influenced not only the thesis around the investments, but also helped us better align our internal resources at InQtel to conduct far-reaching and sort of more forward-leaning research on behalf of our partners. Any comments or highlights from that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but that was really what got us started. We saw what was happening in the market, and we said we better go out and systematically, take a look at this. And so we did, and that was really in the form of that survey. And I should mention my colleagues on that survey. That included Ryan Lewis, Todd Stavish, and Devin Brand. All the four of us worked together on that survey, and talked to a lot of companies and a lot of people in general, and created that initial thesis for what we were doing next, and created the initial framework. We were a little bit scared when a few months later, an actual aerospace engineer showed up in the form of Dave LoBosco, and we weren't sure what he was going to say about all the stuff we've been doing, but I think it turned out all right.
That's great.
Absolutely.
In addition, Dave, sorry to interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say, the market survey was a great sort of starting point, but we've done at least two more of those since then. Every 2 years, I mean, the industry hasn't stayed stagnant, and it's continued to evolve. We did another one in 2016, I think, more of a global competitive analysis view of what was happening in commercial space technology. And more recently, which I think one of our future podcasts is going to touch on, is kind of where space is today. What are the new markets developing around that of sort of these space auxiliary services or in-space support technologies, in addition to the constellations that are doing the Earth imaging. It's more of that space-focused economy that's coming next.
That's right. And let me be second to plug shamelessly that if you're enjoying the conversation today, we encourage you to check out the rest of this trilogy of the history and the current and the future associated activities at InQtel related to space. It's worth mentioning our remote sensing lab, Tom. I believe shortly after you and the colleagues you mentioned started looking into this arena, we also at InQtel started a research lab around remote sensing technologies and how best to sort of leverage some of the commercial capabilities there. Could either of you comment on CosmiQ Works and sort of how that went and how it's going currently?
Yeah, so CosmiQ Works, what effectively happened was that core group I just mentioned sort of split in two, and some of us stayed with the deal side, and some of us went to CosmiQ Works. And CosmiQ was really set up to illustrate the art of the possible in what's happening in commercial space to our customers. Here's what's happening. Here's how you might use this data productively in different ways, and really kind of show the way. And that's what that group did. It was not a big group, and I think they were highly successful in engaging with a variety of different parts of our customer base and demonstrating kind of what was happening and how it might be relevant to their capabilities.
Dave and Tom, I want to be cognizant of our time. We're almost approaching the end of our recording session here. Are there any other matters or highlights that you'd like to discuss when it comes to the involvement of InQtel in the space domain historically?
I guess one parting thought I'd have is that it was a really exciting time, in that 2014, 15, 16, doing that first set of investments in these SmallSat constellations, low-cost launch, the analytics tools. We started at a brief pause, slowdown, not really a pause, to kind of see how those panned out. And it's been great to see a lot of those coming on orbit, coming online, providing data to the commercial world as well as to our partners in government. and starting to provide that impact that we talked about. After that brief pause, we continued to look for new things and are continuing to invest in space technology and other areas that we see as sort of new business opportunities to leverage and new opportunities for our partners to take advantage of for their national security mission.
Yeah, I'd say just to add to that, I mean, you look back in the early days of what we did, we were kind of guessing at a thesis, and it turned out to be, I think we made a lot of good guesses. And so that, we're pretty proud of the work we've done to this point. It continues. I mean, we see a lot of activity in the sector. As we talked about, the government customers are starting to really latch on to commercial space in a way that they wouldn't have a few years ago. And so it's really, we're building on what we did in those years, but we are still really active. We see a lot of stuff going on. The government's engaged more than they have been. The investment sector is, as we talked about, really engaged. So it's going to be exciting to see what happens in the next few years.
That's real promising. Tom and Dave, I want to thank you both for being the mavericks when it comes to In-Q-Tel and space. You and your colleagues, special thanks for getting us into a domain that I think has proven to be very fruitful, both strategically as well as financially, and will likely continue to be so into the future. For our listeners, in case you'd like to learn more about In-Q-Tel's involvement in the space domain, our investments, and any of the capabilities that we've sort of discussed during the course of this discussion, please visit our blog at iqt.org/blog. And you can also tune in next week, where we will continue our 3-part series and explore more recent IQT efforts in space, technology, and beyond. Again, Tom, Dave, thank you for your time. Really great talking to you and appreciate you being here.